Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program from Washington. On today's show, the Latin American elections and the future of our region. Our guest today, Alexander Main, Senior Associate for International Policy of the CEPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Alex Main, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you, good to be back.
Alex, what about your analysis on the results of the elections in Brazil, the first round?
Well, obviously the big surprise, particularly for those who are following the elections fairly superficially, was to see that Marina Silva is not making it into the second round. Everyone had expected that to happen, and instead she ended up losing by over 20 points to Dilma Rousseff. And so now it's Aécio Neves and Dilma Rousseff. And I think it's a very interesting fact because, in a sense, I think Marina Silva's candidacy was a bit of a media construction. And she was portrayed as being very progressive, very pro-environment. And of course, she did represent those things some time ago. But over the years, her positions have shifted. And obviously, the alliances that she formed in this candidacy were much more to the right. And she was aligned with big agribusiness interests, with the banks, and had a more and more obviously sort of neoliberal agenda, very close to that of Aécio Neves. But I think the media construction fooled people, including in Brazil, for a while, and I think she benefited from voting intentions from a lot of the youth that had demonstrated a year and a half ago and during the World Cup. I think those people believed that she represented a progressive alternative, but it eventually became clear that that wasn't the case at all. In fact, she is just a neoliberal alternative to the PT.
What was very interesting, we had the opportunity to be there and cover the first round, was that Dilma Rousseff got 10 million votes more than the number two, Aécio Neves. But the media, that always in Latin America and in Brazil is not the exception, was something like the non-invited candidate. The only thing that they were putting emphasis was in the difference between Dilma Rousseff, the big winner, and the number two, Aécio Neves, rather than the 10 million votes. The only thing that they were mentioning was the problems, quote unquote, with the economy. Never ever the issue of that Dilma Rousseff got 36 million people out of poverty, 42 million passed to the middle class. For the first time, they have medical attention. It's all the social improvements. It does not exist on the fabulous media machinery that is going on in Brazil.
Well, yes, and you know, the media everywhere, I think, often has fairly short memory, and they've been reflecting mostly on the economic situation of Brazil since the recession. What they don't underline is the fact that under the PT governments, under Lula and Dilma, you've had extraordinary growth of the economy, and that counts these last few years. It's been 3 times as fast as the previous years. And I think a good part of the Brazilian electorate remembers that. And they remember that under Cardoso, and of course Aécio Neves represents the sort of Cardoso neoliberal agenda, the economy grew much less slowly. There weren't the same social programs. There was a great deal more unemployment and so on. So things have vastly improved for the poor. Poverty has declined by 55%, extreme poverty by 65%. Those are huge achievements, and I think that's being reflected in the elections today, despite the sort of media war that you have against Dilma Rousseff and her record.
Now, going into the runoff, talking about October the 26th, there are some analysts that say this is going to be the power of the people, of the voters, of the people who were benefiting from those social agenda against the media machinery, rather than the other voters.
No, that's exactly right. And I think, what the media doesn't capture as well is the very big differences between the two candidates in terms of their foreign policy. I think that's something that's often missing. Under the PT governments, you had a much more independent foreign policy from Brazil, and a decision, for instance, to decide not to be a part of the US's plans for a free trade agreement of the Americas, and then to take some brave foreign policy positions in terms of regional alliances with Venezuela, with Bolivia and other countries, in terms of also relations with Iran and trying to resolve the situation of Iran and the sanctions against Iran. These have been very outspoken positions that you could not expect from Aécio Neves. And I think Brazil would play a very different role on the world stage under Aécio Neves than under Dilma Rousseff.
Aécio Neves is already mentioning that he would like to improve relations with the US, that he's pointing his finger that the economy for the coming years is going to grow at a very, very slow pace, and that definitely he won a smaller state or smaller government, neoliberal recipes.
That's right. He's announcing a formula that did not work for Brazil back in the 90s, that led to a rather disastrous situation, a big economic slump. Whereas, Dilma Rousseff is offering a much more progressive alternative. And it is interesting to see how Aécio Neves is doing his best to show that he wants to be a friend of the United States, to the point that he's talked about forming an alliance with the US to build regionalism, to build a stronger region. Whereas, of course, under the left-leaning governments of Latin America over the last 10 years, the region's gone in a different direction. It's gone into a movement for integration without the United States.
22 million votes got Marina Silva, the candidate that ended up in third place, as you were mentioning before. Now, this is a big prize. How those 22 million votes are going to end up, if it's going to, some of them are going to veer versus Dilma, the favorite, or versus Aécio. What do you think?
Well, again, I think, there is a media construction around Marina Silva and what she represented that a lot of people, including within the Brazilian electorate, sort of believed in. They fell into that trap. And that ultimately they do recognize that Aécio Neves is a right-wing candidate and that the only real progressive alternative is Dilma Rousseff. I think there were many people who voted for Marina Silva who have progressive ideology. And they simply were duped. They believed that she represented a progressive alternative. And I don't think that they're going to vote for Aécio Neves. So I think the PT camp can probably be optimistic about the results of the second round of the elections.
Well, we have also in the region another country that we're changing contracts with oil producers, with gas producers, that is Bolivia, and the economic revamp of the country was tremendous.
Well, and that's exactly why today Evo Morales faces no significant political opposition. The economy there has done remarkably well, and that's something that my organization has looked at very carefully. The statistics show that this is really the best period of economic growth for Bolivia in recent history. And one of the big reasons are the sort of heterodox policies that the Bolivian government followed that resulted in outcry from the IMF, from the big banks, etc., which were, mainly nationalizing the gas and oil sectors, raising the royalties from private companies working in those sectors. And it's led to a huge amount of growth. The revenues from oil and gas back in 2005, before Evo Morales was elected, were at about 10% of the national product, of the gross national product.
And today?
And today, 35% of the gross national product. So, it makes a huge difference. And of course, a lot of these revenues have been invested in social programs. So definitely, many people have been lifted out of poverty, millions of people in Bolivia.
The region has another election coming. Uruguay on supposedly first round, because they're anticipating that there is not going to be a definite winner on the first round, that is on October the 26th. What's your reading?
Well, that's an interesting case because it really should be something akin to Bolivia or other countries where the economy has been very strong, normally a very strong economy, and Uruguay has experienced strong economic growth. The economic situation has been good over the last few years. Normally with that sort of situation, the incumbent is strengthened. And in this case, it looks like Tabaré Vázquez will probably not win in the first round and that he'll have to go to a second round. So the only real explanation I can find for that is, for one thing, the media. And the private media in Uruguay is similar to Brazil and very much opposed to progressive politics in general, including Tabaré Vázquez's candidacy. That's certainly a big component. And also there is, I think, just an element of fatigue. People have been under the same
political party
for many years now, the Frente Amplio for nearly 10 years. And after a while, many people, particularly young voters, just are ready for anything new. But in the case of Uruguay, the new alternative isn't that new. It would be going back to the National Party, so one of the traditional parties, which is very right-wing. And though the candidate may be a good deal younger than Tabaré Vázquez, I think people will not be duped either, and they'll realize that this does not represent a progressive alternative for Uruguay.
And the irony, if you want, is that we're talking about a country that for, almost 200 years, two traditional parties, as you said, the Nationalist Party and the Colorado Party, were sharing government. The progressive Frente Amplio came on board, started to win big, and now only the two previous traditional parties together barely reach the same intention of vote that the Frente Amplio has. So there has been an incredible diminishing of the traditional parties, and now the only hope is that if they add up the votes of the two together, they eventually could present some chances to win to the Frente Amplio.
I think that's very unlikely. I mean, things don't work as arithmetically as that. You can't just add the votes together. I mean, there are people from the Colorado Party that are a good deal more progressive than people in the National Party and that are more likely to vote for the Frente Amplio or not vote at all. So I think the Frente Amplio should have every reason to believe that they have strong chances also of winning these elections.
So Alex, if you add up the social progress that we have seen in Brazil, now we were adding up what happened in Bolivia. On top of that, we're mentioning Uruguay. What's going on in terms of the political landscape in this 2014 or the coming last quarter of the year?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I mean, the fact that Brazil, things are not as simple for Dilma Rousseff as people thought originally, the fact that it isn't as simple as people would have thought in Uruguay, the fact that you have difficult economic and political situations at the moment in Venezuela and Argentina has led some of the analysts, particularly here in Washington, D.C., to say, oh, this may be the beginning of the reversal of what has been called the pink or red tide throughout Latin America, and that things will go into reverse, things will balance out, there will be many more right-wing governments now coming to power, and so on. I think it's way too early to be saying that at this point.
Is that wishful thinking?
I think it's extremely wishful thinking. It seems very unlikely really that Dilma Rousseff will, lose these elections. Very unlikely as well in Uruguay. There is plenty of time for things to recover in Argentina and also in Venezuela. They can correct certain policies. There's certainly an opportunity for those governments to consolidate ahead of elections. And, aside from all that, I think there's very little doubt that the general political agenda throughout the region has changed enormously. It's much, much more independent from the US than it used to be, much more independent from Europe. And in fact, it could be argued that Latin America today is much more independent than Europe is from the United States. And some things that show this, recently you had the invasion again of Gaza by Israel. Many ambassadors from Latin America were withdrawn. I think altogether 8 Latin American ambassadors have been withdrawn, including ambassadors from Chile, from Peru,
Ecuador.
Ecuador. So countries that are center-left, left-leaning, and so on. This marks a huge sort of change. And Israel is not the U.S., but generally, the U.S. is aligned with Israeli interests, and Latin America in the past used to be aligned with the U.S. in backing those interests. So we're not seeing that anymore. Another sign of the times, I think, is to see that the next Summit of the Americas that will be taking place in Panama, the president of Panama himself has invited Cuba to participate. Panama is, often seen as one of the last sort of strong allies,
of the US.
Strongholds of the U.S. in Latin America. I think today it can be argued that the U.S. has even to some extent lost a country like Panama, which they have had so much control over traditionally.
What would you say that is the influence of the U.S. in Latin America today versus what it was some time ago?
Well, it is enormously declined. And the U.S., to its credit, put up a good fight. Under the Bush administration, the U.S. was very aggressive in trying to halt the left-wing tide. It did everything that it could to overturn the government in Venezuela, for instance, and of course in 2002 they briefly managed to for about 48 hours. It was very, very aggressive against the governments of Bolivia and Ecuador when they emerged as left-wing governments. They also tried to undermine the PT. I mean, there's also evidence that they tried to undermine the PT in Brazil. So, they put up a big effort. Perhaps they would have done more had they not been as distracted in the Middle East, and perhaps that gave a little bit more breathing space to the Latin American left to develop over the last 10 years. But certainly we've reached a state now where the region as a whole has consolidated in its independence towards Washington. And I think we're not going to see a reversal of that, even if there are some right-wing victories in the near future.
There are new institutions like CELAC, but also you have Mercosur, you have UNASUR, you have ALBA. What is your reading about that shows what? Well,
so these are incredibly important developments. And of course, with UNASUR and CELAC, what it's translated into is much more consultation, much more consulting that's taking place at the executive level between governments of the region, much more frequently between heads of state, between ministers and so on. So this is a level of coordination that didn't exist before and that is extremely positive for Latin American integration. On the other hand, there haven't been strong institutions that have been built out of this, and I think this is somewhat intentional on the part of a lot of the governments.
So there's
they do
some room
not want
to go.
to replicate the Organization of American States. The Organization of American States' political influence has declined enormously, continues to decline. And what we've seen over the last few years is that you do have a lot of new institutions, and of course UNASUR and CELAC are two of the very important ones, very big developments since 2008. In recent years, there hasn't been the strong leadership that you saw when, simply put, President Chavez and President Lula were in power. And I think that has to do with, the situations, the political situations in those countries, the fact that those leaders have been more focused on internal difficulties. Obviously, the economic difficulties is enormous. But again, I think they have an opportunity to recover, to consolidate, and to resume leadership. And of course, you've had strong leadership from other countries. Rafael Correa certainly stands out as a very strong leader as well that has helped move forward the integration process. But I would say today, what the region needs is more strong leadership on the global stage, and hopefully after some of these elections we're going to be seeing more of that.
We have the opportunity to talk with Mark Weisbrod about the case of Argentina, and he wrote an article precisely about the case of the vulture funds, los fondos buitres, and his article said who shot Argentina, and he believes that the suspicion goes to the right wing based in Miami. Is something or someone or many parties behind that ferocious attack to Argentina?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there is a collusion of interests, of disparate interests. You have the hedge funds themselves that are, multi-billion-dollar economic powers that, of course, pool a lot of resources into strong lobbying in the U.S. Congress that has been partly effective. And then you have the ideological component as well, of course, coming from, as it has traditionally, the south of Florida and the South Florida delegation that is very intent on seeing a rollback or a reversal of the left-wing tide. And Argentina is a key piece of this. They're very, very opposed to Argentina, particularly with some of the positions that Cristina Kirchner has taken in recent years on Iran, etc., showing a great deal of independence from the United States. This is something that has really sparked their ire, and so they have made it a part of their campaign for the vulture funds to be successful in their suit against Argentina, so as to undermine Argentina. But I think, Argentina has reacted somewhat heroically, has refused to sort of concede and sit down with the vulture funds, with the holdouts. And this has actually forced some very powerful actors, including the International Monetary Fund, to actually take the side of Argentina, because things reached an extreme. It's a huge irony. But the IMF today is taking the side. They just came out with a report, a strong report saying that, the legal contractual clauses of, future restructuring agreements for sovereign debt need to be amended, need to be changed to avoid vulture funds playing the role that they're playing. And actually calling on the US Congress to also take legislative measures to weaken the vulture funds.
In the case of the Pacific Alliance, is that a way from Washington or from some right-wing forces coming from different areas to sort of counterbalance the advancement of the progressive governments in the region?
Absolutely, it has. It's something that they have been trying to do for a long time, this alliance of countries with which they have free trade agreements. That's what it is, essentially. Yeah. Those are the countries today: Mexico, Peru, Chile. So an alliance of these countries, in Colombia, an alliance of these countries, which have tended to have right-wing governments, and even when they have left-leaning governments, sometimes right-wing economic and trade policies, against UNASUR and other efforts of regional integration. And I don't think it's been successful. There's been a lot of bluster. They have a lot of meetings, a lot of op-eds. The US has done everything they can to promote them, with even Vice President Joe Biden writing op-eds to promote the Pacific Alliance. But I think ultimately it hasn't really undermined things. I think it is helpful, actually, to now have Bachelet playing a role in the Pacific Alliance, because she is not as interested in following the Washington agenda and will not, I think, be as amenable to it becoming a political instrument to try to undermine other attempts of regional integration.
What can we expect from the next 2 years, or the final 2 years, of the Obama's government foreign policy vis-a-vis Latin America?
Unfortunately, I think we can expect very little. In general, whether it be on the foreign policy front, the domestic front, it will be, what they call a lame duck government, very politically weak, basically with all political hope and capital being concentrated on the future candidate. The Democratic candidate will most likely be Hillary Clinton. One could expect perhaps a few more measures in favor of better relations with Cuba and a partial lifting of the embargo. I think that's probably as much as we can expect at this point. If they haven't done more sooner, it's because the Democrats continue to believe that they have to appease the right-wing forces in the south of Florida in order to win the state of Florida as a whole in national elections. I think that's been a very false move. I think the demographics have changed, there's been an evolution, and the Democratic Party has not evolved and is now still letting its foreign policy towards Latin America be controlled by a small right-wing constituency in Florida.
Alex Bain, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Jorge.